My name is Kevin Baginski, and welcome to A-List. Today with me, I have Bruce DuMont, founder of the Chicago Museum of Broadcast Communications. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about the network, your network.
Well, the DuMont Television Network was the first television network. It was founded by my late uncle, Alan B. DuMont. Went back to actually, it started basically in the early 40s. Interrupted by World War II, which a lot of communication and television development in the country was stalled because of the Second World War. And it competed with NBC and CBS in the early days of television. But again, the economic vitality of the era really didn't support a 3 or 4 network. So it was the first network up, and it was the first one that basically went out of business in 1955.
So do you know anything about how they use minorities to appeal to minority viewers?
No, I understand that in some of the early dramas that they did, they had some minority actors in hopes that they would increase a minority audience. And I think one of the big things to sort of put into context is that both NBC and CBS, which everybody knows, and they were huge radio networks, they had a huge stable of stars. And so when television came along, they were able to take the stars, their radio stars, and move them and create television vehicles for them. And the affiliate owners of these radio stations generally became the first holders of television licenses all over the United States. So there was a built-in relationship between CBS and NBC because they were so dominant in the world of radio. DuMont was not involved in radio as a radio network, and ABC really was not a major factor at that particular point. It was really the big two. DuMont was the third, and ABC was also struggling to find a spot to be the third television network. So that was really the context of what was going on. So DuMont had to do things that other stations and other networks were not doing. They had to go out and develop new personalities. So for instance, they reached out to a lot of theatrical people who worked in Broadway, because that represented an opportunity for them to come up with something unique. Mm-hmm. They also sports. They were the first ones to put football and baseball on television. Wow. Because sports was not something that the other networks really were involved in. They were also the first to really understand that really the future of television was on the West Coast. So they tried to get a beachhead on the West Coast and use some motion picture actors. So they were looking for new pockets of stardom, if you will, to really give them an opportunity to compete with NBC and CBS. And the other thing that you do when you're young and struggling is you give opportunities to a lot of young, unknown people. People like Ernie Kovacs, people like Jackie Gleason, again, in developing, creating kid shows, which were immensely popular during that period of time, mm-hmm. and also giving, putting sports on television, putting wrestling on television. They were the first to put wrestling on television, again, building the new stars. And they were also the network that first put Notre Dame on football, put them on the air. Wow. And they also reached out in the late 50s. They put a priest, Bishop Fulton J. Sheen. They put him on TV, and that was really the first successful religious television star in the history of the medium. So they had to try some new things because they didn't have the big stars of NBC and CBS.
So did they do anything else? Like I remember hearing that they actually made TVs to.
Well, that's what they did first. My late uncle was an inventor. He was the developer of the cathode ray tube, which is one of the major tubes in television. So first and foremost, he was an engineer. He would manufacture television sets, also did some significant work in radio in the 1920s. So he was really an inventor. And like anything else, once you invent a television receiver, you better have something for
go
a
behind
person
it.
to watch. So then that led to the television network and led to developing a part of the business that he wasn't as comfortable with. But my uncle also had polio as a young boy, and so when he grew older, he would have to walk with a discernible limp and with crutches. And in the early days of manufacturing television sets, the assembly line of building DuMont television sets, which were first marketed in 1938,
Wow.
long before the Second World War, the assembly line had been retrofitted for handicap, for disabled people. And so if you look at the history of manufacturing television sets in the United States in the late 40s and early 50s, the explosion of that manufacturing was done because disabled people were given an opportunity to work on the assembly line to create DuMont televisions, which were at the time, they were the classiest, they're the highest quality television sets that you could buy in America.
So that's a lot about the DuMont television network, but you're more into radio. So you have a radio show called Beyond the Beltway?
Well, it's a radio show and also a television show. You are correct. I sort of like radio better, but my background is both radio and television. The program that I do is called Beyond the Beltway. It's now in its 37th year on the air.
Wow.
And it's every Sunday night. And I bring together people that are to left of center, to right of center. We talk about national politics. It's syndicated in 35 markets all over the United States. It's on Sirius and XM satellite radio. And since 1996, it's also been a television show every Sunday night at midnight on WYCC, the public television station. And the rest of the week, it's on Comcast cable systems starting Monday nights at 11 o'clock. And so we also, earlier this year, we started to live stream the show. So it's a radio show, it's a TV show, it's a streaming show, it's on commercial radio, it's on public radio, it's
everywhere.
And it's on the internet. Yeah, it's everywhere. Remember the brand. If you remember Beyond the Beltway, you can watch it on your computer and on your iPhone whenever you want.
That's really cool. So what made you want to make that show?
Well, back in 1980, there was a contest for president. Jimmy Carter was the incumbent Democrat. He was challenged in the primary by Senator Ted Kennedy. The Republicans had a big, primary campaign where Ronald Reagan ended up being the nominee. But there was some political change that was happening in America. And I was, at the time, doing a general interest talk show for WBEZ, the public station in Chicago. And I went to the general manager one day and I said, I want to do a show by, for, and about political junkies, the people that absolutely love politics. And I want it to be for the consultants and the people behind, and I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining what everything was. This was really meant to be for the insiders, where they could really get together and every week have a knockdown, drag out, almost like sitting in on eavesdropping on a conversation.
Yeah.
And so she said, well, let's try it. So it began as a 13-week experiment in 1980, and 37 years later, we're still doing the show. And it was called, the first several years, it was called Inside Politics, because it was a local show on WBEZ in Chicago. In 1992, the program switched to WLS, and prior to that, we started to syndicate the program in 1989, and eventually we just continued to syndicate the show. And then in 1994, after the Republican takeover of Congress, we switched the name of the show from Inside Politics, which was about what was going on inside politics in Chicago. We changed it to Beyond the Beltway because we were then a national show. And we really wanted to be a show that really represented a Beyond the Beltway perspective. It isn't the same 16 to 20 people that show up on Fox and CNN and MSNBC. The same, they go from show to show. It's about 16, maybe 20 people now.
Yeah.
I wanted something different. I wanted something that was beyond the Beltway. It didn't represent the inside Beltway perspective. and I would say that it sort of represents the constituency, I think, that recently reared its head with the election of Donald Trump. People that were fed up with Washington. They didn't believe that all answers came out of Washington, D.C. from a political perspective. And it's a freshness. We don't have all the usual suspects on every Sunday night, but there's always two people that are left of center, two people of right of center, and I'm sort of the ringleader, and I either have to pour some oil on the fire to get it going, or sometimes to douse it a little bit if it gets over the top.
Yeah. What made you want to call it Beyond the Beltway? Where does Beltway come from?
The Beltway is the term that is used if you live inside or you live in Washington. The highway around Washington is called the Beltway. It runs from Virginia and Maryland. And so I wanted to be, so it's almost like living in the Loop in Chicago. You live within a specific area. Well, I wanted the perspective of the show to be from people that live outside the Beltway or beyond I used beyond only for the alliteration of Beyond the Beltway. I thought rolled off the tongue quicker, but Beyond the Beltway is, it's the name of the show. It's also my personal philosophy. And so everybody sort of gets what it is right now.
It's a really good idea. You're also the Radio Hall of Fame curator. When did you start that?
Well, actually, the Radio Hall of Fame is, I'm a member of their steering committee now. But the Radio Hall of Fame was an idea that originally started in 1988 by the Emerson Corporation in New York. And they had a couple of ceremonies, not very impressive ceremonies, I might say. And after doing it for several years, the Emerson Corporation was going through some fiscal problems, and so they were in the process of giving up. They weren't going to have the award ceremonies because they just couldn't basically get their act together.
Yeah.
So I made an overture that the Museum of Broadcast Communications had a very strong radio collection. It had its own studio. It had some major artifacts. So I approached the Emerson Corporation to basically take it off their hands, to acquire it from them. And in 1992, we acquired the National Radio Hall of Fame from the Emerson Corporation. We gave it a real live home in Chicago as part of the Museum of Broadcast Communications. We established a very legitimate process from which people are nominated and then inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame. The annual ceremony, which is held in Chicago, it's the biggest night of the year for people who live in radio. We've inducted over 172 people. Wow. We just had our induction ceremony in early November of this year. It's always in November. And it is the place, if you are in the world of radio, it's the thing you aspire to. Obviously, aspiring to any Hall of Fame is important for those that work in that particular field. And so the Radio Hall of Fame and the Radio Hall of Fame Gallery, that's the entire second floor of the museum, is the physical National Radio Hall of Fame, but it is the induction ceremony, it's the process, it's the big induction, it's all part of the Radio Hall of Fame. And I brought that to Chicago in 1992. It was an event that had never been on the radio, so we legitimized the process of induction. We put it on the radio, and it was on the radio for over 25 years.
Wow. So how many people are in the Hall of Fame right now? There's
172, given the most recent group that we have, and they are people, and this was also something very important to me because it's people who work in radio, who work at the local level, who work at the network level, public radio, commercial radio, disc jockeys, sportscasters, comedy morning teams. Mm-hmm. And the other point is, which we wanted it to be a place also for people that work in local markets, because radio is really about localism now. And there are categories of people that are syndicated on more than one market, and there's a category for them. There's certainly the category for the people that were on the radio in the 30s and 40s when radio was the principal entertainment medium in the United States. So many of them, the Jack Bennys, Burns and Allen, Red Skelton, people of that nature, Paul Harvey, just Lowell Thomas, all those people are in the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've spent your entire career in San Diego or Chattanooga, Tennessee, or Cincinnati or Cleveland, we believe that you should have an opportunity to be in the Hall of Fame as well. So each year, generally, I would say probably the most emotional speeches come from the men, and this year women, who spent an entire 20, 30, 40-year career in one city. They're in love with the city's in love with them,
Mm-hmm.
and yet the people around the country may not know who they are. But they're very important, very talented people that really have helped kept radio alive in their particular market. So there's a place for them in the National Radio Hall of Fame as well.
Oh, of course. You got an Iris Award. What is that?
An Iris Award was a long time ago. An Iris Award was given by the National Association of Television Program Directors, and this would have been, I think, in the late 80s, if my memory serves me right. And I was producing a documentary series in Chicago called Channel to the People, and that particular show for which I won the Iris Award, it was the best local television documentary of the year, as deemed by the program directors, and it was about teenage suicide. And it was an extremely emotional show to do. To produce it, the program basically, there was, and I believe still is, a group of parents who have lost their sons or daughters to suicide. And so they get together on a regular basis. And this was attending such a session with cameras rolling to hear the heart-wrenching stories from these parents' perspective about the loss of their sons. And so I went there. I spent almost 3 hours in the session. We recorded it all. I spent, weeks in the editing room putting the piece together. I don't think I've ever done a program that affected me more or longer than that show. I mean, that was over 25 years ago, and it just, the emotional connection that people who are observing and hearing these just incredibly tragic stories told in a first-person account. We put together, I think, a pretty riveting documentary, and it was voted the best documentary by the Iris Awards Committee in that year.
So how did you feel when you received the award?
Well, actually, it was an award that there was no dinner. They announced that you had given the award, and they sent the award to you. So there was no, and the winner is. I mean, I didn't know. It wasn't that type of an experience. I had that, when I got my first Emmy award, but not for this award. It was just they informed you through the mail, and then they sent the beautiful, nice, plaque to you, which I have on my desk in my office.
So what did you get the Emmy for?
Received the Emmy for the Noon Break Noon Break with Lee Phillip program on Channel 2 in Chicago, and then also received one for the Callaway show, which was for WTTW. I've received 2 local Emmy awards.
Cool.
And then spent not on the receiving end of the awards, but also on sort of the presentation end, is I served 6 years as a judge on the George Foster Peabody Awards and was the chairman of the Peabody Awards in my last year. This goes back about 12 years ago.
Okay.
And that's when you could give awards as opposed to receive them. It was a lot of fun to do that as well.
So you were the founder of the Chicago Museum of Broadcast Communications.
Yes, the Museum of Broadcast Communications.
What made you want to make that?
Well, I'll try to give a short story. Back in the late 70s, I was producing the Noon Break show with Lee Phillip at Channel 2 in Chicago. And I would go back to the record library, which is also where they kept the tapes. They were 2-inch tapes. There was no the big, bulky 2-inch videotapes, some 1-inch as well. And they had films and everything else. And literally, they were all piled up. They were like falling over. No one was taking any care of them. And I would look at the side of the box if indeed it had any identification on it. It would be, the visit of the Queen in 1959, the death of Mayor Daley in 1976. Important moments in Chicago history that were on those tapes. And because I was a producer there, if I wanted to take a tape and go to my buddy in the master control and wanted to watch that tape, I had the ability to do that because I had this nice little job at Channel 2. So it bothered me that a lot of this history was just being ignored. They weren't even cataloging. It wasn't even indexed in any proper way. So in 1982, I was on the board of governors of the Chicago Television Academy, and they were looking for a way to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the TV Academy. And so I raised my hand at a meeting and I said, I think we should have a museum where stations could donate their tapes and they would be preserved for the future. We would, take the tapes so they would be preserved, and we'd have somebody that would look at them and come up with an index card. This is when people were dealing with index cards before computers. So the president said, these were the words that changed my life: DuMont, you're a committee of one. Go ahead, work on it. And I took that responsibility, and every month I would go and give my monthly report to what I was trying to do. And most people were patting me on the head saying, this is a good idea, but I'm not going to give any money to this idea. And I said, well, let's not, this is an idea that we should have done 20 years ago. Let's not meet in 20 years from now and wish and say that it should have been done 40 years ago. Let's do it now. Everybody was just patting me on the back. I thought it was a good idea, but nobody was writing a check. And then in August of 1983, two things happened. Fahey Flynn, who was the top newscaster in Chicago, died unexpectedly. And in the same week, Frank Reynolds, who was the anchor of ABC Network News, who came from Chicago, his career was nurtured in Chicago, he passed away. Two major personalities. And one afternoon, speaking on behalf of the president of Channel 7 in Chicago, both ABC, she informed me that at the memorial service the following week, the general manager of ABC Chicago was going to give me a check for $5,000 in memory of Frank Reynolds and Fahey Flynn. And just that day, I had had lunch with Rance Crane, who was the publisher of Advertising Age and Crane's Chicago Business. Because I had gone to him to tell him my idea, and he also sort of patted me on the head but didn't go for a check. But I called him back. The minute I got the phone call, I called him back. And I had only had lunch with him about 90 minutes earlier. And he said, terrific, I'll match it. So we went from $0 to $10,000. And then I was able to go back to all the people that had patted me on my head and said, let me know when you got some money. We organized in October of 1983, on the day the White Sox were playing the playoffs against the Baltimore Orioles. I'll never forget that. We organized when we were watching the playoff game. And from that moment on, the museum has grown, and it's one of only 3 broadcast museums in the United States, and now in a beautiful 62,000 square foot facility at State and Kinsey in downtown Chicago. Never looked back after that moment.
Wow. So do you have anything else you would like to discuss that we haven't covered?
No, other than, I'm very anxious that people become more aware of the Museum of Broadcast Communications. As I said, it's only one of 3 broadcast museums in America. A lot of people don't know that the significant role that Chicago has played. When you think of television, you think of New York, you think of Hollywood. But people have got to understand the significant role that Chicago has played in the history of radio and television. And a lot of famous people came from Chicago. Excuse me. And one being Walt Disney. Graduate of Chicago Public Schools. Edgar Bergen, who created Fibber McGee and Molly, or who created Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy in the 1930s. from Chicago. Bert Tillstrom, who was with Kukla, Fran, and Ollie in the early days of television, from Chicago. William Paley, the founder of CBS, was born in Chicago, graduate of Schurz High School. So it's important for people to know that Chicago was and continues to play an important role.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. My name is Kevin Baginski, and this has been A-List.